If I'm known for anything as a historian, apart from being a pain in the neck, I'm something of a gapologist. I can spot gaps in archives, and they're much more difficult to spot because they've been papered over and the files have been closed, and it's only by going through the archives over a period of many years you get the gut feeling that something isn't there that should be there. The fact that back in 1936, President Roosevelt sent US Marines to invade Canton Island, at that time a British possession out in the Carolines, I think it was, over the water some way. Canton Island, it was a little tiny desert island in the Carolines, peopled at that time only by one British resident, capital R, British resident, who had his native wife, and they lived in a grass hut, and they had the Union Jack run up on a flagpole. And Pan Am needed that island for an interim stopping point on its flight down into the South Pacific. And so Roosevelt sent Marines to throw the British out. Now, you may find it surprising that there's no reference to this in the British archives. Well, it is referred to in the catalogue of the British archives. You'll find it says, American Foreign Policy, Canton Island, closed until the 21st century. So I'm not going to be able to see them. This is a typical example of the gaps you look for. You'll find the papers on them in the American archives, clearly enough, which is how I first came to find out about this, in the private papers of Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior at that time, which was part of his purview. If you look at the biography of Winston Churchill written by Martin Gilbert, you'll find on one page of volume 6 that something has clearly been removed referring to November the 26th, 1941, which is a very important day in the history of pre-Pearl Harbor. November the 26th, 1941 is the day when we prevailed on the Americans to stand firm with the Japanese, thereby ensuring that war did break out. And on that day in the Martin Gilbert biography, you'll find a paragraph has obviously been removed at some time because there's been a reference to a letter that the president has been taken out on that day. And we know it's gone because in the next paragraph, Martin Gilbert rather foolishly continues with the words, on the same day, such and such a thing happened. So you can spot where the gap was. Obviously, it's all been shuffled up again and the pages have been reset, but something's been taken out relating to November the 26th, 1941. We don't know what precisely happened on November the 26th, except by odd allusions to it in the diaries of Roosevelt's staff. So the gaps begin to become significant. And if you look in the American archives under that date, November the 26th, 1941, you can see the serial numbers of the telegrams, and suddenly there are 2 telegrams that had serial numbers that are not in the archives. They vanished from the archives. If a serial number was allocated to a telegram and that telegram number was not used, then a blank page goes into the archives with a reference number not used. So 2 telegrams have been removed from the archives because there's a gap in the numbering. I remember reading one of Rommel's diaries. And Rommel had just lost a particularly stupid battle in November 1941, and he realized a week or 2 later the stupid mistake he'd made, and he had his secretary, a corporal, retype the page in the diary, correcting history, correcting events after the event. And the corporal sat down and religiously typed it out, and he made the mistake that all of us make on the first day of any new year. He put the wrong year on the head of the page. November 1942. I mean, this is a clear giveaway. And then you realize what it was that was making you unhappy about the British and American archives. And it's a huge thing that's so big that you wonder why you didn't spot it in the first place. And it's the big things that people often don't notice. Over the water in London and here in Washington. In Washington, the American government have now released all their Japanese intercepts. Everything that was decoded from the Japanese diplomatic files and some of the naval files and military signals and water company messages and so on, that we were decoding in 1940, 1941 and those years onwards by the famous magic machines, Diplomatic Code Purple, the other various codes of that series, have now been released to the National Archives in Washington by the NSA, the National Security Agency. Millions of pages of intercepts that were generated by the Japanese and decoded by the Army and Navy cryptographers of the Americans during the Second World War are in the American archives. In the British archives, there is not one single page of a Japanese message decoded by the British. Occasionally, going through the files, you do find, for example, I was going through the files there a few months ago and I came across a very low-level order by Churchill on security. And they're looking at the movements of the Japanese foreign minister and his chief of staff, a man called Ismay Rice to Churchill, saying, well, what ought we to do about the attached documents? And the attached document, which is quite obviously from the content an intercept of a Japanese message, February 1941, has been withdrawn by the British government. And there's a withdrawal sheet there saying the attached document has been withdrawn, but you don't know what it is. You only know from inference, from the covering letters, that it is an intercept of a Japanese message. So what does all this mean? It means that we British were definitely reading Japanese signals in the years before Pearl Harbor. And it means that we are so ashamed of what we were getting out of those signals that we dare not admit, A, that we were reading Japanese messages, and B, we dare not take the risk of releasing any of those messages into the archives and seize what inferences to draw from them. And we are entitled to draw a further inference, C, from this, and this is that people who hide things are doing so out of a basically guilty conscience. The Americans have not hidden any of their Japanese intercepts, so far as we're aware. And I think any authorized historian will go along with me on that particular claim. The Americans have been enormously upfront about releasing all their intercepts now into the National Archives. In fact, it's an embarrassing profusion of intercepts. We don't know what to do with them. There are millions of them. No one historian has time to go through them all. There are so many. And yet we British have not released a single page. We don't even find scattered, misfiled pages in the archives. You've all been sedulously weeded out of the files.